So, in our last lesson, we talked about social interaction, and now we're going to move into socialization. So, basically, the process that helps us to develop our sense of self that is involved in those social interactions. For the majority of this conversation, we're going to be looking at micro level analysis of how we become who we are um, and of different types of socialization and different agents that help to socialize us. So, when we discuss socialization or the lifelong process in which people learn the attitudes, values, and behaviors appropriate for members of their culture, we're really looking at a discussion of how you develop your sense of self and identity as far as who you are. And usually, this discussion looks at a balance between nature versus nurture. On the nature side, we're looking at your personality and your psychology and your preferences that are innate. And then on the nurture side, we're looking at your social environment and how our experiences and interactions help to develop our sense of self or who we are. So, for sociologists, we don't look at nature and nurture as an either or. We look at it as a both and. That both our biology and our psychology, along with our social environment and basically the sociology, combine to create ourself. However, for this course, we're going to be looking primarily at the socialization side. So, how does our social environment impact who we are? So, one of the things we look at is our personality and how that can be both psychological and sociological as far as the development of personality. Some of our personality is just a natural emergence of our patterns of behaviors and attitudes and our dispositions that just comes out or manifests over the life course. And other elements of our personality are heavily influenced by our social environment, who our family is, who our friends are, and what culture we're raised in as well. We typically believe that our socialization begins from birth, if not before, and that it doesn't end until we basically are at the end of our life cycle. Um, and that socialization appears in many different ways. That there's primary socialization, which is, that initial socialization that begins at birth and occurs usually at home or with the family. Typically, that socialization begins as soon as a child is born, and it's determined that they're, either a boy or a girl, and there's an assignment that's made based on that. And often in many societies, there's a difference in treatment based on that as well. There's also secondary socialization, which is the learning that takes place outside of the home. So typically, secondary socialization occurs starting from the time you're school age and where you enter the public and start to develop some understandings of beliefs and attitudes and behaviors beyond those that are taught at home or in the home. We also talk about these agents of socialization as well. And these are social forces that influence our lives and alter our self images. And they often mimic or they coincide with our social institutions. So, for example, one of our primary socialization agents of socialization would be the family. And it's typically the family and its cultivation, its structure, and how it views gender and childhood that starts us on a pattern of socialization. Um, Often, this is where kids are taught things like manners and the early childhood development takes place. So, like encouraging kids to walk or to talk and teaching them songs and playing with them and things like that. But it's also where children can be encouraged to become increasingly independent, or towards certain um, careers and occupations, and through learning how they structure their free time, and whether they focus on accomplishment or play, or if they focus on helping, and learning how to prepare for adulthood as well, can really be influenced by the family, or at least starting with the family, and definitely can start to set the tone for our socialization. Another agent of socialization would be the school, where typically we are learning in environments that are not easily accommodative of differences. And so typically with the school, we learn a lot of uniformity. There's not a lot of flexibility in schools as well, so kids typically are learning in rigid and specific ways. Everybody's pretty much learning math in the same way or learning how to read in the same way within the school system. Although these things change over time, the experience for individual children is pretty much the same. And schools are also a place where we learn, preparation for our roles of the future. So we might be learning how to stay outside of our house for 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, and being prepared for becoming little citizens and how to treat other people and behave, which are really lessons that we'll use throughout the life course. Another agent of socialization would be the peer group, our friends, and this is kind of where we start to see a little bit of a change and trajectory from those social institutions. So with peer groups, or those groups of people who are around the same status and around the same age as we are, we start to be socialized via peer pressure, and there's a conformity expectation among our peers. And it's also a space where we get a lot of information when it comes to mate selection and romance. And often that information is incorrect, but still we consider it and we add it to our repertoire of data on friendships and relationships. And some other agents of socialization you'll find familiar, because they are representing those social institutions again. So the mass media and technology help to socialize us, especially if we're looking at generations and what technology has been available and how it's been used. I love it. My kids are often referred to as the iPad generation, because they haven't really known a time where there weren't iPads or these very portable devices full of information and entertainment at hand. And so we look at what that means for their socialization and how that's different. Um, but also just the availability of information and being able to communicate and how that impacts our socialization as well. The workplace is an area for socialization too. We get some practice in the educational system or school system, but the workplace really perfects that socialization and what our expectations should be like, for our day-to-day experience. And it's really a big one that we don't give enough credit to. We're going to spend the majority of our adult lives, most of us, in the workplace, and the majority of our day-to-day experience happens at work or in an occupation of some sort. Some other agents of socialization really focus on social control, like the agent of religion, in socializing us and teaching us how to behave and where to prioritize our efforts, and also the state and government as well, and telling us what we can and can't do and how we should and should not behave. So those are our agents of socialization, and they're all pretty important when it comes to our development of self. It's interesting because we like to think of ourselves as being highly individualistic and very unique. And as a result of being involved in these very conservative and often rigid systems of socialization, we end up being a lot more similar than different. So I very briefly want to highlight two more types of socialization, and that is gender socialization and anticipatory socialization, which aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. Gender socialization is really how we learn about the gender roles, right? Remember, roles are those behaviors and expectations regarding the proper behavior that's attached to activities of a binary, typically of being male or female, right? And so in society, we are typically taught very early in life that there are certain expectations for proper behavior, attitudes, and activities for boys and for girls. And because we live in a society that majorly emphasizes a binary, it's usually one or the other. Um, as we grow older, we start to see more space develop for a gender neutral space or for non binary existences. But early on, despite the fact that we learn gender and aren't necessarily born with it, we're pretty limited in expectations. And again, it can start really early on, as soon as we see a doctor give some sort of gender reveal. We start to see that parents will treat their children differently and refer to them in different ways. They might tell a boy to not cry and to be strong, or they might encourage a girl to maybe, be more ladylike. They might even treat a baby more delicately, or perhaps for some, even allow them to breastfeed at different, like extended periods of time, depending on whether they're male or female. Um, Gender socialization is huge in society. And you can see its importance when somebody misgenders a baby. For example, even for me, I'm not big into like my kids being gendered in any way. I really don't care what their favorite colors are and things like that. But if somebody says that my baby girl, who absolutely does not look like a girl or a boy, it's just a baby, is a boy, I will feel for a moment just a small amount of offense. Like, obviously, this nondescript being is a girl, can't you tell? And then I have to check myself. And that's because our society puts an emphasis on gender and how we perform our gender as well. We'll talk about this more though when we get into our gender and sexuality stratification chapter. It's really fun. Another type of socialization, which can include gender socialization, is anticipatory socialization. And this is a process of socialization where a person actually rehearses for a future position or occupation or relationship that they might be expected to hold. So often anticipatory socialization, again, it shows up as gender socialization. So for example, having our kids play house and, having expectations for them on what roles they play, like who's playing with the kitchen. That was actually a thing recently where people were saying that it was inappropriate to gift a young man or a little boy a toy kitchen, which makes no sense. But it was a result of both gender socialization and anticipatory socialization. And again, makes no sense because when we look at the anticipatory socialization in particular, who's more likely to be a chef? Men. So what we learn from this is that there's an anticipation, for girls and women to cook when it comes to the private sphere or at home. But if it comes to making money for cooking, that we attach to being masculine. And so chef's costumes are actually often, for kids, very masculine in nature. And if you do see a little boy playing with a kitchen, he's more likely to be wearing some little chef hat or something like that that makes it tolerable for him to be in that role, right? And so, yikes, it's a little odd that we have imposed these very strict and rigid boundaries on children, but yeah, we do. And so it's interesting, again, to think about how much we think we're unique. When in reality, we have set a lot of limitations around ourselves for what's appropriate as far as our socialization. Same comes to like playing with dolls or toys in general. You'll notice that usually toy aisles in stores are separated. They may be very blatantly like marked with boy and girl, or you'll see all pink, and then suddenly you'll see action figures show up that are blue or black and things like that. And that anticipatory socialization is true when it comes to career or occupational socialization as well. It's really interesting when we look at the toys that our kids play with and how boys' toys are more likely to be related to an occupation, in particular outside of the domestic sphere versus girls' toys. Boys will get science sets or things related to STEM or construction, and being doctors or firemen or police officers. While girls are more likely to get things related to domestication, like baby dolls as toys, although it's weird to me because babies aren't that fun to play with. Um, or a kitchen set, or even like cleaning toys. Black and Decker used to have a line, I don't know if they still have it, of like vacuums and stuff that were branded Black and Decker, but were toys, and they really were marketed towards little girls. Although today we're getting better about this and saying that we can make money off of all genders. And so you're starting to see that either they make multiple versions of a toy that are maybe blue and pink, or they've tried to aim for more of a gender neutrality, to get more money from parents. And so yeah, you'll see that most of the girl stuff is more fantasy based. So like looking at princesses and fairies and things like that, and less focused on occupations. So it's really interesting to kind of break down um, that sense of who we are and our identities, and look at how society kind of molds those identities or that sense of self, and encourages us to go into certain directions. So, our avenues of socialization actually mark transitions in our socializations or sometimes complete changes. One avenue of socialization is a rite of passage. Rites of passage are rituals that mark a symbolic transition from one social position or social status to another. And so those rites of passage can include celebrations. They can be typically positive in nature and somehow want to aim to incentivize or mark a transition from one state to another. So, can you think of some examples of rites of passage? Often, what comes to mind are things like quinceañeras, which are used to um, mark a girl's transition from girlhood to womanhood in Hispanic and Latino communities. Or high school graduations can be a rite of passage, or even something like marriage or childbirth or adoption, which are marking a transition from being, in school, or from being a young person into being an adult or adolescent, or for being not a parent into being a parent, or from being single into being a part of a couple, and so on and so forth. Some rites of passage may be a bit less tangential or transformative. So, for example, turning 18 or turning 16, even being able to like legally buy cigarettes and lottery tickets versus being able to drive a car, or even in the US, turning 21, which is usually the legal age of like complete adulthood, or being able to drink and participate in other activities. And so, yeah, rites of passage are used to typically mark some transition from one status to another, or movement for some roles to another set of roles. You could say that a form of role exit known as retirement is actually a rite of passage. Usually, with retirement, there's some sort of celebration or acknowledgement of someone's contributions to a status, like being an employee. They might receive gifts. There might be a date and a party that's planned or something like that. When it comes to adult socialization, that can include these rites of passages, but typically it may be focused on complete changes in our socialization. And some of these terms we already use, but we often use them incorrectly, like resocialization. Resocialization isn't just, learning some new terminology or learning some new patterns of behavior that come with a new status. Instead, it's a complete process of completely discarding former behaviors and replacing them and accepting new ones as a part of a major transition in one's life. And so, resocialization happens within these contexts that are really transformative. For example, going into a reform school or into some sort of like major rehabilitation or therapy group, prisons or a religious conversion setting, or even in political indoctrination camps. Typically, that's where resocialization happens because this is not just like a change, but it's considerably stressful for the individual. And it's much more devastating and impactful than general socialization. Often, resocialization can take place in a total institution. And a total institution is an institution that regulates all the aspects of a person's life under a single authority. So, for example, it could be entering into a prison or in the military or a mental hospital or a convent. Usually, you're cut off or separated from the rest of society, and all of your needs might be taken care of within that entity. Typically, agents of socialization that would be considered to be total institutions have four common traits. One, all aspects are conducted in the same place under that single authority. Two, the activities within that institution are all conducted among others in the same circumstances, and so it's pretty uniform among all the members. Three, the authorities devise rules and schedule activities without consulting with the participants, sorry. They don't really care about your schedule and your availability. You're just expected to go with their flow because they are the authoritative figures. And for all aspects of life within that institution are designed to fulfill the purpose of the organization, right? And so everything that you're doing is about that institution, and there's really nothing outside of that institution that's being considered there. Often people experience a specific type of rite of passage when they enter into a social institution called a degradation ceremony. Um, and these are not as fun as the previous types of rites of passage that we discussed. These degradation ceremonies are just that, they are degrading. And so, or sorry, degrading, they're degrading. And so they are very humiliating oftentimes. And they're meant to dehumanize and strip people of their individuality. So, for example, a degradation ceremony might be experienced by someone who is entering the military. And so they might go into boot camp and get haircuts. They receive standard issued dress and glasses and things like that. Their names change. So instead of being known by their first name, often they are known now by a particular title and their last name. And so this may not necessarily dehumanize, although some people do feel dehumanized because their individuality is removed. But it's basically meant to put everyone in a uniform position and to decrease that sense of individuality. Other degradation ceremonies that can be a bit more humiliating. It might be when one enters prison and all their belongings are taken. They might be searched. They're now given a number. And so instead of going by their name, they're now known as inmate number 315, 231, or something like that. So yeah, these are some examples of degradation ceremonies. These are typically rites of passage that you're not really interested in participating in. And finally, we look at some of the theories of socialization, basically looking at how we go through the process of developing our sense of self or that distinct identity that sets us apart from others. We need to keep in mind that our self is not static, it's dynamic, and it develops and changes throughout our whole lifetime. So, the first theory that we'll look at is Cooley's looking glass self. And this actually emphasizes that the self is the product of our social interactions. And so, actually, we were expected to discuss this, at least according to your text, in the previous chapter, but I wanted to save it for now because it goes so well with socialization. So, basically, Cooley's looking glass self looks at how our sense of self is developed through our interactions through multiple phases. And that in the end, these phases help to show us who we are by interacting with others. So, in the first phase, we imagine how we present ourselves to others. So, for example, we have this image of ourselves that we've developed, what our personality looks like, or even just what our appearance looks like. And so we come up with some sense of identity and self that we want to present to other people. And then, as a result of our interactions, we imagine how others evaluate us. And typically, we're just kind of looking at how people respond to us and using other people as a mirror. And based on what we think their judgments of who we are, we come up with some sense of evaluation from those others. So, for example, I'm a professor and I come up with some notes and some, ideas for how I want to present information and present, a lecture. That's phase one. And as a result of standing up in front of a class or receiving feedback from my students, I imagine how my students evaluate me and how well I do that job or how well I may not do it. And so I use my students often as a mirror to reflect how well I'm doing. Now, here's the problem because nobody's actually giving me direct feedback, I'm interpreting, right? And that's the third phase. I'm interpreting that feedback based on that mirroring and developing some sort of feeling about myself, like respect or shame, that may not be grounded in reality. I could be absolutely wrong about how people evaluate me. Maybe my students all look like they're falling asleep, but that may not necessarily be my fault. This becomes an issue in particular in our relationships and friendships. And I'll give you an example. So, with Cooley's looking glass self, remember that we're going to develop some sort of self concept. If we think that the evaluation is favorable, then that self concept is going to be enhanced. But if we think it's unfavorable, then that self concept is going to be diminished. And sometimes we either misinterpret, right? And our self concept is off because of that, or the reflection that's given to us is inaccurate. And so then our self concept could be off. So perhaps, again, I'm a professor and I deliver a lecture in a particular way. And my students all give me really positive feedback, right? They make me feel like I'm the best at doing my job, even though I objectively may suck at it, right? However, because of that reflection, I'm going to respond in a way that, one would for favorable feedback. So I'm going to think, oh, this is great. I'll just keep doing this. It works, right? When in reality, it's like, oh, she's really not good at this, but I don't want to discourage her. And we do this in relationships all the time, where we have someone in our lives that can be very annoying, but instead of making them aware of that, we smile and nod, and we say, yeah, you're great, like, oh, you're so funny. When in reality, we're like, oh, I wish they would stop doing that, right? And so Cooley's looking glass self, while being a great explanation that's really fun, it acknowledges also, or it should acknowledge also, that there's a lot of room for misinterpretation. and miscommunication. So yeah, it's just a disaster waiting to happen, often where we're using our interactions to develop a sense of self. So George Herbert Mead gives us another theory of self-development via stages of self. So again, we're still looking at social interaction. And so here we look at these stages of self as the I, the me, and the other. With the I, we're focused on one sense of agency, action, or power. And typically, this is the mode that infants operate in, infants and toddlers, where the focus is on their own agency, their action, and their power. They want to be in charge, and they only want to do what they want to do. They are in, they are focused on the I. It does not matter how inconvenient it is. It doesn't matter that the zombie apocalypse is happening right here and now. All they are concerned about is a very selfish and inward focus on the self. So a baby is hungry. Maybe it's a convenient situation, but most likely it's inconvenient whenever they say they're hungry. That's just my anecdotal, experience. And so what do? They just start screaming and they just keep screaming. Does it help the food to get there? No. Right? Does it help them to feel better? Maybe. But really, it's just about their immediate sense of self and what they need. And it has nothing to do with whether or not they're helping or hurting a situation. The me is the self as a distinct object to be perceived by others. So the me actually includes the I. It includes that sense of agency, but also we start here to begin to see that other people have a sense of who we are, um, and that other people are watching us and are coming up with some concept of who we are and what our personality is and judging us on that. And this starts to develop usually around school age as kids start to take on other roles and start to see that they themselves are a part of interactions and a part of groups, and that it's not just about them totally. And then the other is the stage where you start to view um, others as someone or something outside of oneself that is equally as important, and views themselves equally as a priority as you do, and that your role, your status is considered to be an other to outsiders, that they view you as another. And so it's almost like I think of it as like this like evolvement from main character energy to starting to be, more aware of others and more considerate of others as well. And to start thinking of the roles and the feelings and the motivations of others. And so typically this starts to develop in adolescence as we become young adults and we're able to take on and understand multiple roles for multiple people. And so you'll often see this happen around the same time as like a game stage where we're able to understand strategy and motivations beyond our own. So yeah. With the other, often that's when we're able to start to grasp the concept of a generalized other, or the attitudes, the viewpoints, and the expectations of society as a whole that you take into account when it comes to your own behavior. And so really understanding those demands and expectations of society. And also when we start to view others, it's hard to have this conversation without using some of the terminology in different ways. But significant others, those people who are special to us and whose care, whose affection and approval we especially desire and we view as being most important to the development of the self as well. So, yeah. So I like this little image, this figure here, because it starts to show you these different levels where you have the individual, the I and the me, that expands with our significant others, who are those people who are most important to us and who we actually care about their judgments. And so they have a lot of impact and influence on our sense of self. And then growing out into these reference groups who are others who we want to be like. So we refer to them as we develop our sense of self. They're often a very important part of our socialization because we tend to imitate them or use them as an example. And then the generalized other, which is kind of the sum of all of the expectations for our behavior, all of the approval that we seek in society. So Mead actually had a developmental platform for the emergence of these distinct stages, starting with the preparatory stage, which was about from birth up to age 3, where children are merely just imitating others and only beginning to understand symbols and communicate through interaction and imitation. They don't really have a strong sense of self other than, just those demands for their basic needs to be fulfilled, and how this develops into the play stage from ages 3 to 5, where children just start taking on roles and that sense of self starts to develop. Children begin to understand their social relationships as they develop skills in communicating with symbols, and they can actually pretend to be others, not just imitate others, but take on those roles and participate in role taking or a process of mentally assuming the perspective of others and responding from those imagined viewpoints. And finally, according to Mead, that moves into the game stage, which begins in the early school years, where you consider several tasks and relationships all at once or simultaneously and grasp not only your own positions, but those of others around you, and are able to respond to numerous members of the social environment and not just, those significant others. And arguably, I think my favorite theory of socialization or of the development of the self is Goffman's dramaturgical analysis. One, because it's just a fun word altogether, dramaturgy, but also because the concept is also pretty fun as well. According to Goffman's dramaturgical analysis, our development of self comes as a development of our presentation of self. And so we are all involved in this impression management, where we alter our presentation of self to create a distinctive appearance and to satisfy particular audiences. And so who we are as individuals depends on where this presentation of self or impression management is taking place and what we're trying to get across. And so that's where we get dramaturgical analysis, where we are approaching this presentation of self using dramaturgy or using actions that resemble performers on a stage. And so that's part of what makes it so fun, because here we're going to look at the way that we step into different roles and put on different masks and props and things like that in order to present ourselves in some way. So according to Goffman's dramaturgical analysis, we have a front stage self and a backstage self. And the front stage self is an area where we are performing a specific role before an audience. With the front stage self, we are on stage and we have put on, our different masks and costumes. Maybe we use different vernacular or terminology, different accents even. We might do some code switching as well. That's where you switch from maybe based on race or ethnicity or class, from a particular set of behaviors that is viewed as being less appropriate among our dominant ideology to one that is seen as being more of the standard or more elitist. So for me, that usually means I start enunciating more and start using, it actually doesn't mean my vocabulary changes because I use ridiculous vocabulary regardless of where I am. But it often does mean that I will use some words that are different, like I might not curse as much, or something like that, or I might be a bit more appropriate as far as not saying things that may be viewed as being, of poor taste or offensive. And that's for me usually a class switch, not a racial ethnic switch, but class. Backstage area is where a player is not required to perform to a specific role or audience because that audience is out of view. And so that might be where you're able to be your real self. And it might be where you're able to let your hair down, is one way that we describe it, and go off script. The work that we do in order to protect that face, right? Face is the esteem in which an individual is held by others. And so the face is the impression, right? The mask. The work that we do to protect that face is called face work. And face work includes any efforts we make to maintain that proper image and avoid public embarrassment. When we're front stage, we typically don't want our backstage to slip or to be seen. And if it is seen, then we can be discredited, or we might say that someone, if their face slips or if that face work slips, they have egg on their face, right? Or basically that some backstage self has emerged that wasn't meant to be seen by the audience. So we'll see that this occurs, for example, when someone slips and falls in public, right? Because the front stage self, you're just supposed to be upright and not clumsy and not falling all over the place. But when somebody slips and falls, they'll often do some face work and they'll laugh at themselves, or even if they're in pain, they'll jump up and walk it off until they are out of view of an audience and act like nothing's wrong. And so we often try to do things to recover our face. This could also happen, for example, if you go out with friends and you think you're like the hottest thing in town, but nobody like asks you for your number or takes any interest in you. And so you'll hear people try to do some face work if they haven't been very popular for the evening and say like, oh, there were no interesting people there. Or, ugh, I'm so glad none of those guys like talked to me, like I must have been out of their league and things like that in order to save face, right? And that's really how we discuss that face work is as saving face. We don't want to be embarrassed, or we may even just want to save others from secondhand embarrassment. And so we do some work to recover that. So yeah, that's basically it. I know that there are some other examples of social interaction in your text, but we're not going to be focusing on any of those. These are the ones that you are going to be expected to know and to be able to apply moving forward. As always, thanks. See you later.